Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Alina and I am a third-year undergraduate student studying history, political science, and criminology. During my time pursuing my post-secondary education, I have studied topics such as international law, the Cold War, 20th and 21st century American history, the Soviet Union, revolutionary pre-Soviet Russia, political philosophy, and state failure, among many other topics. In today's video, which will revolve around the question, why isn't Iran democratic today? I seek to provide historical context that will serve you in navigating the global events occurring today. To do so, I will touch on the following topics: the 19th century Great Game between Britain and Russia, the St. Petersburg Treaty of 1907, sometimes alternatively called the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, Iran in both world wars, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the 1933 Iranian oil concession, Iran in the Cold War, Iranian oil nationalization, the CIA and Iran, and a bit more. If these topics are of interest to you, please keep watching. When considering the question, why isn't Iran democratic today, many people often change this inquiry to resemble something like, who was Mohammad Mossadegh and what was America's relation to him? I personally believe that this second inquiry is very important. For those who are unaware, Mohammad Mossadegh was Iran's first democratically elected prime minister, a man committed to leading a nationalist government and determined to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which was, at the time, controlled by colonial Britain. He was in power for less than 3 years before he was overthrown, and the preceding government, which would last 26 years, would be overthrown in the infamous 1979 revolution, which established Iran's Islamic Republic. Iranian history, however, spans further back than the 1950s. Though I will, of course, situate the information here in the context of the Cold War, I will also go further back so that the colonial domination of Iran, suffered for many decades prior to Mossadegh's time, can be brought to light as well. An article by the title of Social Policy in Iran in the 20th Century explains that Iran entered the 20th century with a population of 10 million and rather dismal social indicators: very high infant mortality, average life expectancy of less than 30 years, absence of any nationwide hygiene or health facilities, and a 95% illiteracy rate. Its economy, which was, quote, in shudders, with its corrupt government bankrupt and controlled by Russia and Britain, lacked any growth momentum and education, and its infrastructure was too limited to support the expansion of production and trade. In essence, Iran was, quote, a sovereign country, but only in name. Iran's constitutional revolution of 1906 was an attempt to change this. As with every revolution, the reasons behind it are complex, much too complex to fully and properly illustrate here. To put this simply, however, the constitutional revolution was supported firstly by the middle class, who had always been traditionally suspicious of the monarchy and now found themselves economically and ideologically alienated from the ruling class, and the modern intelligentsia, who saw the liberal ideals of constitutionalism, secularism, and nationalism as a path forward. On top of all of this, these two groups, who had started to accumulate more power and influence throughout the 19th century, knew that the Iranian royal dynasty was not only, quote, financially bankrupt, but also administratively weak, morally discredited, and militarily ineffective. The economic crisis of early 1905, which saw inflation rise uncontrollably, was also instrumental to the revolution. Here, sugar prices spiraled upwards, and in urban centers like Tehran, the price of wheat rose by 90% in only 3 months. To deal with this predicament, which had been brought on by factors such as bad harvests, disruptions in northern trade caused by a cholera epidemic, weather conditions, and the Russo-Japanese War, among other things, the Iranian government raised tariffs on native merchants and postponed repayments to local creditors. These decisions triggered intense public protests that culminated in the aforementioned 1906 revolution. Iran's constitutional revolution, through calling for a constitutional parliamentary democracy, established its National Consultative Assembly on August 6 of 1906. This establishment of a new parliamentary government was partly in an effort to break Anglo-Russian control over Iran, which had played out during the 19th century conflict known as the Great Game. In describing the period of the Great Game, Shireen Blair-Bryzak writes that, quote, Persia at the turn of the last century was a land in chaos, a battleground of Russian and British spies, accurately and unabashedly recounting the feuding British and Russian empires that sought to subjugate and control regions in the Middle East to serve as buffer states for their more pressing imperial ambitions in India and Asia. This decades-long Iranian Great Game, which had dominated Iran's 19th century, would eventually end in a draw after the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, where the British and Russians basically agreed to secretly split Iran into 3 separate regions: a British one, a Russian one, and a neutral one. This treaty, known by some as the St. Petersburg Treaty of 1907, has been described as, quote, practically dividing Persia into British and Russian zones of influence and making a mockery of Persian independence. Iran's constitutional revolution had little time to find its footing before it, like the rest of the world, was swept up in World War I, where Iranian efforts to pursue a neutral third power policy failed. Iran's underlying sympathies toward Germany and Turkey, fueled by the colonial hatred of its old British and Russian imperial subjugators, meant that the nation would see a quarter of its population dead and its territory overrun during and immediately after the war by Russian, Ottoman, German, and British forces. As the British competitors started to weaken, fall, and then disappear, and with the Russians finally withdrawing due to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, British forces began to dominate Tehran's government and occupy much of Iran. As can be imagined, the Constitutional Revolution, secret partition of Iran, World War I, and then the foreign occupations of the country all coalesced into one huge disaster. These factors meant that, internally, Iran had, quote, largely disintegrated as an independent entity. Additionally, Iran's Democratic Party had split during World War I. One faction, known as the Organizationalists, favored centralization, whereas the other, known as the Anti-Organizationalists, favored provincial autonomy. This division was so sharp that the party never recovered its unity or its prominence in Iranian politics. These factors eventually accumulated in 1921 when Reza Khan rose to power through a swift military coup. Incredibly, Reza Khan, who would eventually become more well known by the name of Reza Shah, united much of the country's fighting political factions behind the call of Iranian nationalism. The article titled Iranian Nationalism and Reza Shah writes that, quote, both liberal and conservative Iranian nationalists were among Reza Khan's most outspoken early admirers, and that the Shah's eventual unpopularity has done much to obscure an understanding of his initial popular support. These religious and secular nationalists supported Reza Khan alongside modernizing reformers who were disillusioned by civilian weaknesses against British and Russian penetration and by a general disgust held by politically aware Iranians of their post-World War I foreign occupation and political weaknesses. Reza Shah stayed in power until 1941 when he was replaced by his son after he was forced to abdicate in World War II. Reza Shah's rise in time as Iran's leader was complicated. Despite the fact that his earlier supporters held strong nationalist sentiments, his ascension to power was secretly encouraged by the British. As Michael P. Zorinsky writes, British aid to the coup was key to its success, and aid to Reza helped him survive. The policy of good relations and non-intervention by Sir Percy Lorraine, the British minister in Tehran from 1921 to 1926, was also, quote, part of the process by which Reza came to dominate Iran. Britain's involvement can be described as such. By the end of World War I, the British feared that the administrative chaos in Iran would be manipulated to gain control of the country and wrest it away from its grasp. Because they believed that the way to overcome this was to, quote, restore the traditional Iranian elite to power, they depicted the constitutionalists in such a way that intervention appeared as a morally acceptable course of action. By dismissing Iran's dominant political players as self-serving, irresponsible agitators, the British intervened against a movement which had supported the full range of Iranian human rights. Once in power, both Britain and Reza Shah understood that Iran could no longer exercise the control necessary for internal stability. To confront this problem, Reza Shah established a standing army and increased Iran's defense budget from 1926 to 1942 by fivefold. The introduction of conscription, establishment of a military academy, and a professionalized military career structure quadrupled the size of the Iranian armed forces from 40,000 to 127,000 in the same time period. The concurrent unification of Iran under centralized rule and establishment of order made it possible for the government to strengthen its own position and begin a process of state building. This process, however, was carried out with a ruthless disregard for human rights in any of its manifestations, and Reza Shah's lack of concern for political and individual rights was matched by a lack of interest in the material needs of the poorest of his people. During World War II, Reza Shah chose, just as his predecessors had chosen in World War I, to be a neutral nation. The historical domination by the British and Russians, however, meant that Iran's sympathies lay with the Germans, something that the British and Soviets both understood. Britain and Russia additionally understood something that they had already understood decades before, in the 19th century Great Game: Iran's geographical importance. In the Second World War, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany was, to put it simply, a catastrophe. To try and alleviate the disaster, an alliance between Britain and Russia was quickly put together. To transport British supplies to the Soviets, however, was tricky and involved three possible options. One was via the port of Vladivostok, which, though successful for the Americans, was useless for the British. This port also lay under the shadow of a restless Japanese empire, which had not yet entered the war but was a longtime enemy of the Soviets and nothing close to a friend of the British. The second alternative, to deliver the supplies through Murmansk, was the most efficient route but nonetheless unfeasible. Ships traveling this route would have to navigate through icy waters while vulnerable to Axis aircrafts, surface raiders, and U-boat packs. Last of the three was a direct path through Iran, a route that came to be known as the Persian Corridor. Despite the fact that it was the only feasible route out of the three options mentioned, Iran had little interest in taking sides in this war, especially to aid those who had previously dominated them. On top of all of this was Iran's oil. Both the British and the Soviets believed that it was imperative that the resource did not fall into the hands of the Nazis, and both the British and Soviets feared, either rationally or irrationally, that a German conventional attack or a pro-German Iranian government would cut off their access to Iranian territory and thus Iranian oil. To solve these problems, the British and Soviets invaded on August 25, 1941. Reza Shah stepped down from his throne on September 16th of the same year and was replaced by his son. Now, let's pause for a moment here and take a separate path. So far, I've spoken about Iran politically and socially. I believe, however, that understanding any society requires understanding three key perspectives: the political, the social, and the economic. Thus, before we continue, I will provide a quick economic history of Iran, which, when situated in the first half of the 20th century, is really almost a history of oil. At the start of the 20th century, the bulk of Iran's income came from land. It had a population of less than 10 million, and almost 4/5 of the population lived outside of urban centers. Its limited manufacturing output was, by and large, confined to carpet weaving, textiles, and hand-eye craft. This changed quickly. In 1901, William Knox D'Arcy, a financier who had made a fortune in the Australian gold rush in the 1880s and was looking for an investment opportunity, obtained a 60-year concession to the exclusive right to prospect for oil through the majority of the country, a territory of around 1,200,000 square kilometers. This agreement, known as the D'Arcy Concession of 1901, paid the Iranian government £20,000 in cash and another £20,000 in shares upfront, and set a vaguely defined royalty of 16% of the annual net profit arising from its operations. In May of 1908, after years of unsuccessful drilling, commercial volumes of oil were found. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or AIOC, was founded. A year later, in 1910, the construction of a refinery and pipeline occurred. In 1912, crude oil processing began in what was, at the time, the world's largest refinery. Around the same time in 1911, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill converted the British Navy to an oil-burning fleet. To ensure a steady supply of oil, he negotiated a contract with AIOC in 1914, which agreed to supply the Navy with bunker fuel at a discount. To ensure the long-term security of this agreement in oil, the British government acquired a 51% stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This agreement transformed the fortunes of the company, secured its long-term future, and created the first combined state international oil company. Disagreements, however, between the AIOC and Iranian government arose quickly. The first, which occurred during World War I, centered around the way AIOC calculated the 16% of its net profits which were payable to the Iranian government under the terms of the concession. To solve this issue, the Iranian government appointed Sidney Armitage Smith, a British Treasury official, to prepare a report on the differences between the Iranian government and the company. Armitage Smith's agreement was not ratified by the Iranian parliament on the grounds that it did not adequately protect the country's national interests and that Armitage Smith had exceeded his authority in reaching the accord. Despite this, AIOC implemented the provisions of the agreement and acted as if it were in force. As Reza Shah came to power, the D'Arcy concession increasingly became a target of public resentment. The Iranian nationalism that had come together to give Reza Shah his throne saw AIOC as a symbol of foreign influence and despised the high-handed manner in which it dealt with the Iranian government, its refusal to pay income tax, and the poor living condition of its Iranian workforce. In November of 1932, Reza Shah attempted a unilateral revocation of the concession. The British government disputed Iran's right to cancel the concession and hauled the Iranian government before the League of Nations. This move started months of back-and-forth negotiations, which culminated in the 1933 concessions, where Reza Shah was outmaneuvered into agreeing to extend the convention for 60 years in exchange for minor improvements, increasing royalty payments, and a reduction of the area available to AIOC. These increased royalty payments, which guaranteed a minimum annual payment of £750,000 and an additional payment of 4 shillings per ton of oil produced, did not take into account the possible rise in oil prices or economic inflation, or protect against long-term devaluation. Under AIOC, the foreign workers occupied the best houses, claimed membership in exclusive clubs, and sent their children to schools and segregated living areas. Iranians were sidelined to unimportant roles and endured slights such as water fountains with the label, "Not for Iranians." In essence, Iranians had basically become secondary citizens in their own country and secondary considerations of their own economy. A man, already mentioned, named Mohammad Mossadegh, sought to change all of this. Born in Tehran in 1880, Mossadegh was the son of an Iranian public official and grew up as a member of Iran's ruling elite. He obtained a law degree in Switzerland and returned to Iran in 1914, where he remained in government until 1925, serving different posts as a governor general, a minister of finance, and a minister of foreign affairs. In 1944, following Reza Shah's forced abdication in 1941, he re-entered public service and was elected again to the Iranian parliament. He quickly accumulated not only a strong political following based on his nationalist pro-Iranian stance, but also widespread social support for his democratic campaign and unshakable determination to put Iranians first. His Oil Nationalization Act, which was passed unanimously by the Iranian parliament in March of 1951, created the formation of the National Iranian Oil Company, or the NIOC, which was charged with taking over the operations of the AIOC. 1 month later, on April 28th, Mohammad Mossadegh was overwhelmingly elected as the Iranian prime minister by the Iranian parliament, a position that the Shah was forced to accept. The refusal of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to comply with Mossadegh's Oil Nationalization Act, however, resulted in the deterioration of Anglo-Iranian relations. In response to this, the US, under President Truman, encouraged the British to compromise and sought to negotiate a solution based on their experiences in Saudi Arabia, where the main producer of oil, the Arabian American Oil Company, otherwise known as Aramco, had agreed to portion the profits in a 50-50 agreement, with half to the Saudi monarchy and half to Aramco's American owners. Truman also agreed that Iranian nationalism might serve as a defense against Soviet communism and viewed the British, with their overly colonial mentality, as crass, backward, and improper. Regardless, no agreement between the Iranians and the British manifested. This failure prompted Britain to embargo Iran, with the AIOC going so far as to try and sue those who bought Iranian oil. Under this political and economic environment, Mossadegh's best efforts were not enough to stop his government from losing 2/3 of its foreign exchange earnings and 40% of its total revenue. This growing economic hardship was matched by the rising political dissatisfaction and popular opposition. To combat this, Mossadegh was forced to rely increasingly on the Iranian left, including the Iranian Communist Party, for support of its policies, even though he had been staunchly anti-communist beforehand. He had famously criticized the post-World War II Soviet occupation of northern Iran by attacking the Tudeh on the issue in 1944, asking, "If you claim to be socialists, why are you ready to sacrifice the interests of your own country for the sake of Soviet Russia?" As you can probably garner from this, Mossadegh's time in power thus occurred in the context of the Cold War, a context that cannot be ignored. Contemporary understandings of the 20th century conflict are usually situated in conversations that pit America and the Soviet Union against each other, with each side explaining that their chosen economic system, that being either capitalism or communism, is good, especially when juxtaposed with the other option, which is often characterized as the ultimate evil and root of all human suffering. This pattern of speech, which is really fundamentally, by my belief, a pattern of memory, is not inherently incorrect, but is not correct either. Though the Cold War was an ideological battle that pitted capitalism against communism, it was also a global conflict that, in its earlier years, operated around national struggles for decolonization in spaces categorized as the Third World. In one of my favorite books, titled The Cold War, A World History, by Harvard professor Odd Arne Westad writes that, quote, "To Third World leaders, the Cold War was an outgrowth of the colonial system. It seemed far too regimented, too absolutist, or simply too European for post-colonial states. In the context of Iran, with its history of being basically nothing more than a pawn on a larger global chessboard in Britain-Russo conflicts, this is especially easy to understand." Despite this, neither the US or the USSR appeared to accept the neutrality desired by these emerging nations. Though Americans, who had won their own independence by rebelling against Britain, did not look favorably upon the concept of empire, and the Soviets similarly looked down at the once dominant colonial powers, both perceived the global political system as fundamentally bipolar, split between two fields. From this inflexibility arose the American belief that any country that did not conform to US visions of liberty and economic growth was sliding toward a Soviet orientation, and the Soviet belief that any third position was simply a stage on the way to socialism and eventually a Soviet form of communism. Note that in World War II, when British and Soviet forces invaded Iran, the Soviets had occupied the northern part of the country and refused to withdraw when the conflict ended. They instead fostered autonomous republics in an attempt to establish satellite states similar to those emerging in Eastern Europe and East Asia. America, who had come out of World War II richer, stronger, and more powerful than before, adamantly opposes and backed the Iranian government's efforts to regain control over these provinces. Though they were supported by Iran's Communist Party, the autonomous republics collapsed in late 1946. Despite their collapse, the Communist Party was still the most popular and best organized party in Iran in the following years. As the Cold War continued, America became increasingly concerned about two options: that the Soviets would invade Iran, or that they would back Iran's Communist Party and use a popular front strategy to allow them to seize power. A Soviet Iran would be less than ideal for a multitude of reasons, but the possibility that Western access to Persian Gulf oil, considered vital to Western security interests, might be eliminated meant that there was a significant possibility for utter disaster. America nonetheless did not have significant involvement in Iran for the first few years after World War II. They were deeply preoccupied with conditions in Europe and East Asia, where Soviet influence and economic crisis was spreading. Furthermore, the isolationist foreign policy pursued by America prior to World War II meant that they were still developing the strategy and organizational infrastructure for its new internationalist posture after the war. America at this time did not have a foreign intelligence service and was hastily constructing one, mainly from the remnants of the wartime Office of Strategic Services. In September of 1947, this OSS morphed finally into its most recognizable form, the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. Even in this increasingly demarcated world, however, Mossadegh still worked tirelessly to better Iran in the ways that he had promised previously. He reformed the Iranian election process and worked to eliminate corruption from the Iranian government. Despite the British-led oil embargo, he pursued his aim of a non-oil-based economy and increased reliance on other homemade goods for exports. Under Mossadegh, Iranian governmental records showed an improving balance on the ratio of imports to exports for the first time in 50 years. The article titled Mossadegh and the People of Iran characterizes Mossadegh as having two distinct qualities. The first was that he had been one of the few political leaders in Iran who believed in the practice and implementation of law and order, and in democracy and the power of the people to redirect their political destiny. Second to these two qualities was his belief in Iran's independence and in the intrinsic qualities of the people. Mossadegh had not been against relationships with other nations, but instead had held that they should be on an equal basis with the mutual interests of both sides in mind. In 1953, less than 3 years after he had been elected prime minister, Mossadegh was removed from power via an American-backed and arguably orchestrated coup. Iran's stubborn refusal to sign an agreement with Britain had shifted America from an attempted mediator to a British ally that came to believe that no agreement would be possible with Mossadegh in power. Under Eisenhower, America re-established closer ties with Britain, and the CIA, assisted by the British Secret Intelligence Service, successfully installed a new pro-Western government in Iran by the end of August 1953. The article, The CIA's TP Badam Operation in the 1953 Coup in Iran, gives an overview of the largest CIA intelligence operation in Iran at the time, titled TP Badam, which employed a large network of Iranian agents and sub-agents to carry out propaganda and political action against the Soviet Union and the Tudeh that eventually turned against Mossadegh. No information about Operation T has been released by the United States government, and the information contained within this article, which explains the launching of the program, the activities it carried out, and its role in the overthrow of Mossadegh, was obtained only through the interviewing of 9 retired CIA officers who worked on Operation T or were otherwise familiar with it at the time. This article, which is 20 pages long, contains too much information to be properly relayed here. Because of this, I will link it in the description box of this video for your personal viewing if it is of interest to you. Of immediate relevance to us is the article's conclusion. It reads that Operation T was a psychological warfare operation aimed at influencing the perception and decision-making of various actors through covert propaganda and political action. Operation T played a central role in the CIA-engineered coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh on August 19, 1953, and utilized black and gray propaganda and covert political action initiatives, such as efforts to organize anti-Tudeh crowds and turn clerics or other actors against the Tudeh. As a quick note, propaganda is sometimes organized into 3 categories, those being black, gray, and white propaganda, which basically function as levels of transparency and truthfulness. White is generally open and generally truthful. Black is deceptive and creates confusion via the false attribution of lies to an enemy, and gray is unknown or generally ambiguous, resting between black and gray propaganda. Here, the CIA's use of black and gray propaganda meant that the information being spread held messages painting Mossadegh as an enemy of Islam and as an ally of the Iranian Communist Party and the Soviet Union. It said that he had been corrupted by power and misled by unscrupulous advisors, and that he was deliberately destroying the morale of the armed forces, leading the country to economic collapse and fostering regional separatist movements, partly to enable the Soviet Union to take over Azerbaijan and Kurdistan. By organizing a stream of misinformation and staging rallies, and by paying Iranians to pose as members of the Iranian Communist Party and attacking Islamic preachers or the advisors of the Shah, the CIA successfully completed their mission objective: to create unrest on the streets and to unify the conservative opposition against Mossadegh. On August 19, 1953, during the second attempt of a CIA plan titled Operation Ajax to violently overthrow Mossadegh's government, Mossadegh's home was invaded, looted, and then burned. Though Mossadegh escaped capture, he surrendered to authorities the following day. During this time, his followers were arrested, tortured, imprisoned, or even murdered. A few months later, on December 19th of 1953, standing before a military court in charge with treason, Mossadegh declared, "My greatest sin is that I nationalized Iran's oil industry and discarded the system of political and economic exploitation by the world's greatest empire. With God's blessing and the will of the people, I fought this savage and dreadful system of international espionage and colonialism. I am well aware that my fate must serve as an example in the future throughout the Middle East in breaking the chains of slavery and servitude to colonial interests." He was convicted of treason, suffered solitary confinement for 3 years, and then lived under house arrest for the remainder of his life. For the next 26 years after Mossadegh's fall from power, Iran would be ruled by a Shah who would eventually be overthrown in 1979 in the Iranian Islamic Revolution, which still rules Iran to this day. I have chosen to end the video here as I believe that there are many resources on the Iranian Islamic Revolution which are likely at a far better and more professional quality than I could hope to produce. Nonetheless, I hope that what we have discussed today will serve as a starting point in understanding modern-day Iran. In the beginning of today's video, I asked about the lack of democracy in Iran. Instead of giving you a direct and succinct answer, I took you all through 100 years of Iranian history in hopes that you will come to your own conclusions. Additionally, it is also my responsibility as a historian to provide a quick disclaimer. In researching for the information provided today, I was required to pick and choose from the huge range of Iranian historical events and academic resources discussing, explaining, and breaking down the Iranian 20th century. It goes without saying that many things have been, because of this, necessarily omitted or simplified so that this massive period of time could be condensed into one singular video. It is my hope that the effort put into creating this video will inspire you to study both Iranian history and the modern political context further. In the description box below, I have linked a full bibliography of all of the sources I consulted to create this video essay. Please feel free to take a look, and if you have any spare time, give them a quick read. Furthermore, I encourage you to leave any comments or questions in the comment section of this video. Just as I am hopeful that you have learned something from me, I am hopeful that I too can learn something from you. Lastly, I have linked my Ko-fi in the description box of this video. I've never really thought about making one, and it never occurred to me that I would be in the position to make one when I created this channel, but I have nonetheless created one as per the request of someone in my last video. If you found this video helpful or informative in any way, please help me out by liking, sharing, or subscribing. This is everything I have for today. If you're still here, still watching, and still listening, thank you, and I hope to see you soon.